All right, let's dive into one of the most powerful and, honestly, most debated ideas in modern political philosophy. We're going to unpack John Rawls's famous difference principle. And to really get our heads around it, we have to start with this absolutely brilliant thought experiment. Just think about that for a second. Imagine you get to be the architect of a brand new society. You choose the rules, the economic system, everything. But you have no idea who you're going to be in that society. You don't know if you'll be rich or poor, healthy or sick, talented or not. What kind of world would you build then? This isn't just a fun little puzzle, it's the entire foundation of John Rawls' theory of justice. So Rawls invites us into this hypothetical meeting he calls the original position. Imagine, we're all there about to agree on the basic principles for our society. But there's a huge catch. We have to make this decision from behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. So what does that mean, veil of ignorance? It means you are a total blank slate. You have no clue about your race, your gender, your social class. You don't know if you'll be a genius or have learning disabilities. You don't know your family's wealth, your religion, or even what you want to do with your life. You're basically stripped of every random advantage or disadvantage that could possibly bias your choice. You're forced to pick rules that are fair for everyone because, well, you might just end up being anyone. Okay, so you're in this position. Total uncertainty, a blank slate. How on earth do you choose? What's the smart, rational move when the stakes are literally your entire life? Would you take a huge gamble? Would you design a society with, say, incredible wealth for 1% of people and crushing poverty for everyone else, hoping you'd win the lottery and end up on top? Rawls says absolutely not. No rational person would. You'd play it safe. You'd use a strategy that philosophers call maximin, which is just a fancy way of saying you would try to maximize the minimum outcome. In other words, you would design a society to make sure that the worst off person is as well off as they can possibly be. And that's exactly why you'd immediately reject a system like, say, utilitarianism, which just wants to maximize the average happiness. The problem with that is what Rawls called an intolerable risk. A society could have a really high average happiness, but it could achieve that by allowing a minority to be brutally oppressed for the greater good of the majority. From behind the veil, you can't take that chance. You have no idea if you're going to end up in that oppressed group. So you'd pick the maximin strategy to protect yourself no matter where you end up. And this whole logic, this idea of playing it safe and focusing on the worst-case scenario, it leads us straight to the heart of Rawls's theory, his most famous and most controversial idea. The difference principle. So here it is, the big one. Now, notice, this principle doesn't demand perfect flat equality. Rawls isn't saying everyone has to have the exact same stuff. What he is saying is that you can have inequality in wealth and income, but there's a huge catch. It's only justified if, and only if, that inequality works to the greatest possible benefit of the people at the very bottom of the ladder. Inequality is only fair if it's part of a system that makes the poorest people better off. So who exactly are these least advantaged people? This is really important. Rawls isn't talking about pointing to specific individuals and feeling sorry for them. It's a structural idea. He's talking about a representative social position. So think about the person with the typical income of an unskilled worker, or someone whose family has less than half the median wealth in society. The goal of the system isn't charity for them. The goal is to design the entire economy so that this representative position is as good as it can possibly be. So what does a society built on this principle actually look like? Well, you might be surprised. This idea calls for something way more radical than just a social safety net or what we normally think of as a welfare state. In fact, Rawls was actually a pretty sharp critic of what he called welfare state capitalism. He argued that just letting the market create massive inequality and then trying to patch it up by taxing the rich to give benefits to the poor, well, that doesn't solve the root problem. He thought it creates a dependent underclass, and maybe more importantly, it still lets vast fortunes concentrate in the hands of a few who then use that wealth to control politics. Instead, he proposed something very different, a property-owning democracy. Let's break this down. A typical welfare state acts ex post. That means after the fact. It lets the market run wild, and then the government steps in to clean up the mess with taxes and transfers. A property-owning democracy, on the other hand, acts ex ante, or before the fact. Its main goal is to stop those huge inequalities from forming in the first place by making sure the ownership of capital, of productive assets, is spread out really widely. So think about policies, like a serious inheritance tax to break up giant fortunes, or major investments in education, and even support for things like worker-owned companies. The point is for everyone to enter the economy as an owner, as an empowered participant, not as someone just waiting for a government check. But as you can probably imagine, this vision of a radically redesigned state has a very powerful and famous opponent, an argument that puts individual liberty above everything else. Enter the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick. For Nozick, justice has absolutely nothing to do with what the final distribution of wealth looks like. He couldn't care less about the pattern. For him, justice is all about history. The only question that matters is, did people get what they have through fair and just means, like voluntary work or free exchange? If the answer is yes, then the result is just, period, no matter how unequal it looks. And this leads us to Nozick's most legendary and explosive critique. He argued that taking money from people who earn it, in order to give it to others, is a profound violation of their freedom. For Nozick, this is not just bad policy, it's a moral evil on the same level as forced labor. His logic is actually very direct and powerful. It goes like this. You own yourself, right? I mean, who else would? And if you own yourself, then you must also own your talents and abilities. And if you own your talents, then surely you own the fruits of those talents, the things you create and earn. So for the government to forcibly take a portion of those earnings through taxes, well, Nozick says that's basically the government claiming it owns a piece of you. Wow, okay, that is a heavyweight challenge. How does a Rawlsian system even respond to the charge that it's violating our most basic liberty? Well, it does it by completely reframing the whole debate, moving away from this idea of isolated individuals and toward the reality of social cooperation. The Rawlsian comeback is to say, hold on a second, nobody earns their success in a vacuum. The most talented surgeon or entrepreneur can't make a fortune without a stable society that provides laws, education, security, infrastructure, all the stuff we all contribute to. Since their success is impossible without this web of social cooperation, justice demands that the rules of cooperation benefit everyone. In this view, our natural talents are less like purely private property and more like a common asset that we all have a stake in. And that brings us full circle. The difference principle, then, is not about charity. It's not about feeling sorry for the poor. It's a condition of fairness baked into the system from the very beginning. It's a way to ensure that those who are lucky enough to win the genetic and social lottery do so on terms that also help lift up everyone else. It's a principle of reciprocity, not pity. And so, at the end of the day, we're left with this massive, fundamental question that gets to the very core of this whole debate. Are our talents and abilities just our own private property to be used for our own exclusive benefit? Or are we all part of a cooperative venture where those talents should be seen as a common asset whose benefits ought to be shared in some way? How we answer that question doesn't just define our politics. It shapes the kind of world we choose to live in.